because I'm pretty sure I'm going to go way more than an hour. I don't know how far we'll get in an hour, so we'll see. And just so you guys know, I haven't done this in about 20 minutes. Bear with me a little bit, okay? So let's pray, and we'll get started this evening. Lord, I thank you for tonight, Lord. Lord, I thank you for, even though you destroyed the world, Lord, that you still provided your grace, and you extended that grace to Noah, and through you just show us what you would have us know through this teaching, Lord. All right, so to get started, I just want to say something real quick, just to kind of clear something up real fast. In case those of you who don't know me, I am like a super Answers in Genesis fanboy, okay? I love the Answers in Genesis thing. Like, it would be like if there was one job I could take at Answers in Genesis, I would take it. Like, if they called tomorrow, I would tell Boo Boo Kitty to, like, pack her bags and load the covered wagon, and we're headed to Kentucky. So that's just, just so you guys know, I love the Answers in Genesis ministry and everything that they're doing. Also, on another note, I've heard positive things about Centerpoint Energy. So just saying, and if they called, I might be willing to take a job from them too. I've heard it's a nice place to work, so let's just put that out there. So tonight we're going to be talking about the third C, which is the catastrophe. And kind of how man's sin led to, and the wickedness of man led to God having to judge the earth. The last 9 months, I've really been into like that whole area between the fall and basically right after the Tower of Babel. I've really been getting into that. So last year, I was with my friends up at their farm. All my friends get together, and we get from high school, and we get together, and we were having a discussion. And what I thought basically what Genesis 6:4 meant. And some other people didn't agree with me, and they said of Seth and some other things, and part of the problem was I was trying to do it on my phone, verses on my phone while conversations are taking place, and it's just not a good thing. And the second thing was, like, I really knew it, but I didn't have it enough to where I could speak coherently to them. So I went back and was like, I'm going to write down why I believe these things, and to make sure that, like, next time I go back that I can discuss why these things. And this led me down not just to the flood and that story, and then the mythologies and how all of these things are all interconnected in some weird big thing. But so we're going to touch on part of that tonight. I'm going to attempt to do my best because, like I said, there's so much information. I've tried to condense it down, but I've got a feeling it's going to go for more than an hour. So at the hour, we'll cut off and we'll just be where we are at. One other thing I want to mention before we get going, because I think it's important to realize that when Moses wrote these books, the first 5 books of the Bible, he wrote it during Israel's 40 years in the desert. And that time period was about 1445 to 1405 BC. So pretty much all of mankind history, it had already been going on for 3,000 years by the time Genesis and the other 4 books of the Bible, the first 5 books of the Bible were written. And so I think it's important because a lot of times when you start to talk to people about the flood and things, they're like, well, these people over here, they wrote a flood account and it was hundreds of years before the Hebrews, and they just copied this, and it's, they're just faking. It's fake because, or it's a myth because they copied from these people. When the reality is all of these people are trying to tell the same story that Moses records in Genesis 6. So I'll mention this kind of again, but just know that a lot of human history had been going on the history of the world. All right? So let's start Genesis 6, and let's look at the first 4 verses here. Now it came about when men began to multiply on the face of the land, And daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, because he is flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and afterwards, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. So let's kind of break down these first couple verses. So, right after the fall of man, the population is starting to really increase for a couple of reasons. One, the age that people would live to. And so they were able to multiply faster. And plus, because of the way the earth was back then, the oxygen content was higher, so people lived longer, and more people were being born, so the population is going all over the earth at this point. And so, all of a sudden, though, you see that there's a problem with ungodly intermarriage between the sons of God and the daughters of men. So the sons of God saw the daughters of men. So this verse is referring to what a lot of people will say, that they believe the sons of God were from a line of Seth, and the daughters of men were from the line of Cain. And so this describes an intermarriage between the godly and the ungodly, something that God specifically prohibits in Deuteronomy 4 and 2 Corinthians 6:14. But trying to pull this together and say that this is, this leaves some unanswered questions. So why did believers and unbelievers becoming married, why did it make God so angry that he wanted to wipe out all the earth's population? So why was there something unusual about the offspring of these unions? The idea that these were believers marrying unbelievers doesn't seem to fit the record of the text, that God is going to destroy the earth because of it. So the sons of God, it is more accurate to see the sons of God as either demons who were the fallen angels, angels that were in rebellion against God, or uniquely demon-possessed men, and the daughters of men as just human women. So the phrase sons of God clearly refers to angelic creatures when it is used the other three times in the Old Testament, which are in Job 1:6, Job 2:1, and Job 38, verse 7. The translators of the Septuagint translated sons of God as angels. Those ancient translators clearly thought sons of God referred to angelic beings, not to people who descended from Seth. In Jude 1, it tells us that the angels who did not keep their proper domain but left their own habitation, 1:7, it tells us, and it also tells us in a similar manner. So what does that mean that they've left their own habitation? So it's basically their habitation, their proper habitation would have died, but they committed another sin by leaving the spiritual realm and entering into the physical realm. The second thing is they gave themselves over, they committed this great sin by turning themselves over to sexual immorality with the daughters of men. That's what it talks about. They were spiritual beings that entered the physical world, and now they've gone after. So God also makes it clear in Jude 6 what he did with these wicked angels. They are reserved in everlasting chains under darkness for judgment of the great day, for not keeping their proper place. Their sinful pursuit of freedom had put them into bondage. So I think that's a great point there when we talk about we're pursuing freedom. A lot of times we try to justify sin as, oh, I have the freedom to do this or I have the freedom to do that. But a lot of times if we really want to look at what we're calling freedom, it's more than likely it is basically the sin of selfishness. It's the greed. The greed, I like to think of it as what we thought was freedom was greed, because it is the greed to have my own way. So in 1 Peter 3, these disobedient spirits in the prison that they were in after the cross, and he proclaimed his victory on the cross over them. So let me go back. So when it talks about, basically, you can kind of figure out why Satan sent his angels to intermarry, whether directly or indirectly, with human women. So a lot of times Satan will come up with some kind of, he's always trying to figure out a way to keep God's promises from coming true. If he can stop God's promises somehow, then he can maintain his reign over the earth. And most of the time, that always ends up, backfiring on him. So part of this is Satan was trying to pollute the genetic pool of mankind with satanic corruption. He was basically trying to put a genetic virus into the human race, making it unfit for bringing forth the seed of the woman, which would be the Messiah, as promised in Genesis 3:15. The Savior could not be born of a demon-possessed mother. So if Satan could succeed in infecting the entire human race, the deliverer could not come. So Satan almost succeeded. The race was so polluted that God found it necessary to start again with Noah and his sons and imprison the demons so that they could never do this again. Satan is always trying some scheme to try to stop God's promises. I think this is one of the reasons that we see a lot of times that the Jews are so heavily persecuted across the world. If somehow they're persecuted, like one of the things with the Third Reich in World War II, if they could have found some way to manage to have ended up killing all of the Hebrews, then there's not the 144,000 remnant for God to come back and pull for him to when the second coming comes. So therefore, there's not there. So that's why one of the reasons I believe that they're always so heavily persecuted. Starting in verse 3, when it refers to, my spirit shall not strive with man forever. So God was not going to allow the human race to stay in this rebellious place forever. So this means that there is a point of no return in our rejection of God. God will not woo us forever. There is a point where he will say no more. You can look at Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 32 at unbelief and its consequences, where eventually God will give you over to a depraved mind and to your own will. He's going to try to seek you out. That's one of the reasons I think when we say, today is the day we need to respond to Christ rather than waiting for another day. It's not necessarily that we could be killed in a car wreck or a bus hit us or something like that, like everybody always talks about. We're not promised tomorrow. We could always die. But there's also a point to where we continually reject God and he just quits pursuing us and turns us over to our own wickedness. So that's basically what's happening here. So when it talks about his days will be 120 years, unlike what Kenneth Copeland says, this is not talking about how long he's going to live or how long people would live or their lifespan. It is basically, this is the judgment to the flood. The flood happened 120 years after this announcement. So sorry, Kenneth Copeland, you're not necessarily going to mean that you're going to live to 120 years because you have used this verse out of context. So when we talk about verse 4, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards when the sons of God came into the daughters of men. So this is a point of contention with a lot of people. And so I think it's important to understand really what we're talking about here. So some translations say that giants were on the earth in those days. And so this is referring to the unnatural offspring of the union between the sons of God and the daughters of men. Although there are people of unusual size on the earth both before and after the flood, the ones that we're talking about here have a demonic element of their parentage. So I'm sure probably all of y'all went home and probably watched some foosball this afternoon and saw those are some very large men. Do y'all remember there used to be a group that used to come around all the time called the Power Team? I'm like, probably no one under the age of 35 remembers the Power Team. But I remember them well because I remember Ivan and I were doing youth in Vidor many moons ago, probably. And we took the kids to go see the Power Team. I think they were. And I remember talking to one guy. They called him the Grip, and he was a Martin from the Oilers. This guy, I think when I went to talk to him, I think I came up to like his rib cage. Not even lying. One of the things that he did for the power team was he could literally squeeze a can of Pepsi until it exploded. That was pretty impressive. And the other thing I thought was cool was because when I was younger and had a little more power in my hands, I used to do it all the time. In fact, somebody got mad because I think I ripped as somebody kept daring me to do it, and I think I ended up ripping every Beaumont phone book in half in our office one time. It was something like 6 or 8 Beaumont phone books, and they were like this thick. There's a real, then you can just strip it down. This guy tore in half 2 license plates together. 2 metal license plates. So, you know. He was definitely one of the people that we would consider a giant today, but he wasn't. When we talk about this, I think it gets mistranslated into English somehow. The word that they use in the Hebrew for Nephilim is essentially Nephilim. But in somehow, and so, like I said, granted, there are people of unusual size back then and then, but that's not what Nephilim is referring to in this case. Of the word, which is NPL, which essentially, I'll let Pastor Kevin, but essentially it translates into fall. So the others to fall down, or the ones who have fallen, or as I like, this is the one I tell people, it means the fathers and they had human mothers, okay? The other thing, human history had been around for 3,000 years before Genesis was written. So God, who they are. He says that they are the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. So the stories, analogies are pointing back to these people. So God is telling them, who these guys are, these people from the stories of mythology. So who can you think of in mythology that had demigod fathers and human mothers? Heracles. So he was the son of Zeus and a human mother. Can anyone think of anybody else that had a demigod father and a human mother? There are 2 cats. They were twins. They're called the celestial twins. Their name or cat. And so, in fact, the Iliad talks about even though they had passed away, they still, once the evil king of Athens had taken Helen of Troy, that they pursued him to rescue her. So, Castor and Pollux are considered to be the Greek gods of sailors and athletes. One of them is depicted as a boxer, and the other is depicted as riding a horse and some other stuff. But because of their celestial twins and the skies guiding the sailors, they are also considered the Greek gods of sailors. So I'm going to say this name wrong, and I have practiced this name, and I'm still going to say it wrong. So there was another guy. His name is Alcepheus. And he is a Greek hero and the Greek god of medicine. He was the son of Apollo and a human mother. You probably know about the rod of Alcepheus. He's the Greek god of medicine. So what would you think is the rod of Alcepheus? It's the staff with the 2 snakes around it. You see it whenever you go to the hospital. You see it whenever ambulance, when the EMTs come to pick you up because you've fallen and you can't get up. So we still use that symbol today. And so also, I think it's important to note that when the Israelites were traveling around Edomite territory, they began to complain to Moses, we don't have any bread or water. And the funny thing about this is, not only were they whining because they didn't have any food or water, but they also let Moses and God know how much they detested manna. The stuff that they were getting that God was providing, they basically told God, we don't even want that. And so how does God respond? No, he gave them 12, and that made them sick. And then what happens? Which part? Well, he sends a whole bunch of snakes, and the snakes bite them. And so after praying for the people, is instructed to put a serpent on a pole and to raise it up, and then anyone that is bitten by the serpent is to look at it, the one placed on the pole, and he will live. This happens in Numbers 21, verses 6 through 9. So Christ also refers to him also being lifted up as Moses lifted the staff in the desert. So any questions so far? Everybody good? Okay. Let's go on and look at verses 5 through 8. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that the intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. The Lord was sorry that he had made man on earth, and he was grieved in his heart. The Lord said, I will blot out man, whom I have created, from the face of the land, from man to animals, to creepy things, and to birds of the sky, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. So it's hard to imagine that there could be any more emphatic a statement on wickedness that we could conceive. I mean, he basically tells us how horrible everyone has become, how wicked everyone has become. Every thought that they had was intent on evil. And so, I think it's important to note that Jesus says that in the days of Noah, it'll also be the same when the coming of the Son of Man. So in other words, the conditions of the world before the coming of Christ will be similar to the conditions of the world before the flood, which includes an exploding population, sexual perversion, Genesis 6:2, demonic activity, Genesis 6:5, constant evil in the heart of man, and Genesis 6:11, widespread corruption and violence. So the Lord was sorry that he had made man, and he was grieved in his heart. So it doesn't mean here, what he's talking about here, it doesn't mean that he was so sorry at man and that he doesn't mean that the creation was completely out of control, nor does it mean that God had hoped something better was going to come about, but it was unable to achieve it. Excuse me. God knew all along that this was how things would turn out. But clearly the text shows us that God sees his plan for the ages unfold, and it affects him. He's not unfeeling in the face of sin and rebellion. I'm sorry. So in verse 7, this is the first time, he's going to say this 3 times. This is the first time he says it. In verse 7, he says, I will wipe out all mankind who I have created from the face of the land, mankind and animals as well, crawling things and the birds of the sky, for I am sorry that I have made them. So I'm sorry, guys, that think that there's a regional flood. A regional flood is not going to wipe out everyone, or it's not going to wipe out every living thing. So there's no way that could happen. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. So while God commanded that all the earth was going to be cleansed of this pollution, he found one man to whom he could begin again. Noah, who found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Notice here that Noah didn't earn grace, but he found it. No one earns grace, but we can all find grace. So Romans 5:20 says, but where sin abounded, grace abounded much more. So let's look at verses 9 through 10. And these are the records of the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his time. Noah walked with God. Noah became the father of 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So one of the other translations I have says that Noah was a just man and he was perfect in his generations. So this description of Noah is unique only to him. Okay, so it not only refers to him and his righteous life but it also refers to the fact that he was uncorrupted by Satan's attempt to sow something like a virus among the genetic pool of mankind. We could translate this better. We could translate it as perfect in his generations, as that Noah was pure in his genetic profile. Does that make sense? He was undefiled the way the rest of humanity had been defiled by the fallen angels and that demonic seed. And then it mentions his 3 sons, which God is going to use them as the foundation for the rest of the human race at this point. So in verses 11 through 13, wow, it's already 30 minutes. I'm sorry, I'm not going to make this. I've got way too much stuff. Now the earth was corrupt in the sight of God, and the earth was filled with violence. God looked on the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way upon the earth. Then God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence because of them, and behold, I am about to destroy them with the earth. So God again is saying this is the second time he's declared he's going to destroy the earth. Some people think like this is kind of harsh, but remember, since the fall of man, we have all received that death penalty through Adam. So however God makes that happen, it's all still for us to all die once. So also, God told this to Noah with the intentions of saving Noah and his family. In the midst of such corruption and judgment, there is also grace. Instead of wiping out the entire race, God preserved a remnant. 14 through 16. Make for yourself an ark of gopher wood. You shall make the ark with rooms and cover it inside and out with pitch. This is how you shall make the length of the ark, 300 cubits. I don't really want to get into like the entire building of the ark. Just know that God's going to give him the instructions on how to build the ark. And one of the things that I find kind of strange is people question, how could they build this giant barge, boat, whatever we would consider it, but yet we have no problems looking at all these other megalithic structures that were created prehistory, whether it was the pyramids or some of these other things, Stonehenge and things like that. We have no problems understanding how they're built or that understanding that mankind can build them, but yet we question how could the ark be built.
Not to mention he had 120 years to build it.
That too. So it's just, there's megalithic structures that are even older than the pyramids that people just accept that, prehistoric man built these things. But yet the ark is out of the question. So he tells Noah that he's going to make it himself. This means it was Noah's project. He was up to him to build this project. He wasn't going to contract it out to Brown and Root or Echo Construction or whomever. It was up to Noah to do this. And so he gives him the instructions and the dimensions of how to build it. So essentially, the ark was as long as a 30-story building is high, and it was 75 meters wide and about 45 meters high. And so what is described is not really what we would think of as a boat, but it was a well-ventilated barge, essentially. It's like almost like a big box. Because after all, an ark is what? It's a chest. It's a chest. So that's what it is. So it's not a ship. So it's talking about it's basically referring to its square type deal. And it wasn't important that the ark could all it had to do was float. It didn't have to sail anywhere, didn't have to do anything. All it had to do was float. Excuse me, I'm sorry. God tells Noah that he's going to establish his covenant with him, and he's going to go into the ark. Despite the dramatic judgment that's coming, God will make a covenant with Noah that he and his family will be saved. God will also use Noah as the remnant of each animal so the earth could be repopulated with people and animals after the flood. So Noah did everything that God commanded him. It was staggering. It was a staggering job to do. But you don't hear anything in the scripture that Noah complained or rebelled. He simply obeyed and built the ark. So this right here is kind of good. According to all that God commanded, so he did. The Bible presents Noah as the great hero of God. He was an outstanding example of righteousness, Ezekiel 14:14. He was a preacher of righteousness, 2 Peter 2:5. And Noah condemned the world by offering salvation in the ark that the whole world rejected, Hebrews 11:7. I think that's a key point there because it's the same thing now. God is offering the world salvation through Christ, but yet the entire world continues to reject him. And so it's the same as the ark. In 2 Peter 2:5, it says that Noah was a preacher of righteousness. Yet in his 120-year ministry, it seems that no one was saved. So, I think it's probably okay for preachers to kind of feel that way sometimes because Noah didn't get anybody either in his 120 years. So in chapter 7, we're going to look at the flood. I'm going to skip some of the text. I really shouldn't, but I'm going to skip it. So I'm going to go back to my commentary because I just feel like I'm going to run out of time. In verse 1, he tells Noah to come into the ark. The idea here is that God was already in the ark and it would be with Noah in the ark. And so he called Noah. He invites him to come into the ark with him. Notice that the Lord did not say to Noah, go into the ark, but come, simply implying that God himself was in the ark, waiting to receive Noah and his family in the ship that was to be their place of refuge and other people on the face of the earth whom were drowned. That was some commentary by Spurgeon. So here's another question I think also is one of those things, like how many animals were on the ark?
At least of every kind.
How many though?
2 of every kind.
Wrong. That was a trick question.
Enough.
No. There were 7 pairs of all the clean animals, and then there were 2 pairs, there was 2 of each of the unclean animals.
I said at least 2.
Okay, I'll give you that. So I think people forget that. I always talk about, there was like 2 of everything. No, there wasn't 2 of everything. There were 7 pairs of the clean animals and the bird and the clean birds, and then 2 of everything else. So, and then people often also question, like, how could God get all the animals to the ark? But yet we don't question how birds migrate to the south in the winter or other animals, hibernate. We don't question that, but yet we question it's easy for God to have put into the animals to basically migrate to where the ark was. So the scripture says 2 by 2 they went into the ark. So God doesn't have a problem getting animals to do what he wants to do. Only man is more stupid than the animal. So look at Isaiah 1:3. The ox knows its owner, and the donkey its master's crib, but Israel does not know. My people do not consider. So as far as following what God's commands, animals are better off or are smarter than people. So in verses 10 through 12, God tells Noah and his family to get in the ark. They're going to be there for 7 days before the rain's going to come. And so people basically had not seen rain at this time. Remember, the earth was basically like a terrarium wherein it basically watered itself from the ground, and it didn't need to rain because it had the water above, the canopy of the water above, and then the water below that watered the earth came up, and then the mist rose up from the earth and watered itself. So nobody knew what rain was when he kept saying that rain was going to come. And so it's kind of a test of faith. They'd spent 120 years getting ready for this. Now they had to get into the ark and basically wait 7 days before anything happened. So in verse 11, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on the same day, all of the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the floodgates of the sky were opened. Rain fell upon the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. So, all of a sudden, the great fountains of the deep have been broken up, and waters came up from under the earth. So, no doubt, this was a great, not just the water coming up, but there was a great geological catastrophe, which we're going to get into here in just a minute. And so it's going to rain for 40 days and 40 nights. The number 40 becomes associated with testing and purification, especially before entering into something new and significant. We can see this number 40 in several different scriptures. Moses' time on Mount Sinai, he spent 40 days there, and you can read about it in Exodus 24:18 and Deuteronomy 9:25. The spies trip into Canaan, Numbers 13:25. They spent 40 days there. Israel's time in the wilderness, Numbers 14:33, 32:13. They spent 40 years wandering the desert. Elijah's miraculous journey to Sinai in 1 Kings 9:8. And then Jesus spent 40 days in temptation in the wilderness in Mark 1, verse 13. So I want to kind of get into basically the destruction of creation real fast. Because when God said that he destroyed the earth, it wasn't that the waters just came up and waters flooded everything. He literally destroyed the earth completely. What we see today when we look outside, we see all these great posters with all these mountains and like, oh, look how magnificent creation is. And we see how beautiful things are. But what we're actually seeing is the results of sin. So we can imagine if what we have now is so beautiful and so magnificent, imagine what creation was really like before this flood came. So, I want to kind of talk about it real quick. I know this is going to sound kind of crazy. I know this is kind of contentious. This is kind of my interpretation of what I take out of the scripture. I'm not saying the Bible doesn't necessarily say this exactly, but there's enough evidence that we can inference that this is pretty much what took place. That there's enough evidence in what we see in the layers that were put down, whether it's coal or whatever, and basically the earth itself, we can kind of see that this is what happened. So when it talks about the fountains of the great deep, and they burst forth and water came, and then the canopy collapsed and all, that's where the rain came from. How did that really look? Because I don't think, this is where kind of I've been like really studying. So I'm going to draw for you, and I know if you're in my Sunday school class, you know how much I love to draw. So basically, when we go back and look at creation, it talks about before the earth was there, it was formless, and it was just water that was out in the void. And so God takes and he splits the water, and he creates the water above, which is the canopy, and he splits that from the water that's below. So you've got water below. Then he makes the dry earth appear. So the dry earth of the crust of the earth is basically appeared. And this is where, it doesn't say this in Scripture, but this is what I have taken from what is evident, or the evidence that's presented in science and in creation. That basically all the water, there were no oceans. All of the water was trapped underneath the firmament of the land. You guys follow me so far? So when the fountains of the great deep burst forth, it blew out and basically launched all of the crust through the canopy of the water, which then caused the water to fall, and then out into space where we get meteorites. Because it says at the beginning that creation was perfect. So that means not just the earth was perfect, but the moon was perfect, and all of the heavens were perfect. But yet when we go outside tonight and we look at the moon, is it perfect? yeah, it's messed up. And so I don't believe, I took some geology classes when I was in college, and I don't believe in plate tectonics. I do understand that the plates are moving around now. However, was everything this supercontinent with water all around, and whether you called it Pangea or you called it Europa, my professor called it Europa, and it was this giant mass. You know, and then it broke apart and how we got to everything. I don't believe that. I believe the entire planet was all one landmass and all one biomass. Yeah, you had lakes. I mean, the Bible talks about that, but you didn't have oceans. You had what the Bible called seas, like the water came up, it went to rivers, and it ran into seas. So you had things like the Dead Sea, the Red Sea, things like the Great Lakes. You know, those would be what we considered seas, and that's what was that was what was across the planet. The oceans weren't there. The oceans were formed by the flood, and I'm going to try to show y'all some things. So I don't believe it. So again, the ocean, there were no oceans. The Bible calls them seas. So I've got some things, and I've got some crazy articles to back up my goofball claims. So if you want to hit that first slide. So did you guys know that in Antarctica that they have found where at one time there were actual palm trees and things on Antarctica? Because there was no ice, there was no water. The whole planet was basically a terrarium. And so here's an article talking about things that they've found. Of course, they're going to give it the gajillions of years, so just bear with me. So Antarctica wasn't always locked away by ice at the bottom of the world. So it was they claim it was part of the supercontinents that broke apart later, which is not true. It was, like I said, I believe, according to the Bible, that the firmament was there, and all the water was trapped underneath it. And so it talks about some 53 million years ago. And here's another interesting fact. 53 million years ago, when atmospheric carbon dioxide levels were much higher, on the order of 600 parts per million, and global temperatures were several degrees warmer. What does that sound like?
How can we know that first?
Well, not only that, but if everything was super green and lush with high carbon dioxide levels, and with those high carbon dioxide levels, the global temperatures were only a few degrees warmer, and yet the entire planet was thriving.
What's the problem today?
Exactly. That's exactly right. Just a little. That was for free. All right. So back then, when this was the environment, you know, Antarctica enjoyed near tropical conditions. Some scientists that were drilling off the coast had turned up pollen grains from this period of Antarctic's period with Antarctic palm trees. So there were palm trees on Antarctica. They found the fossils, okay? There are also trees that they found that are tropical and subtropical, much like what you would find in South America, Australia, and New Zealand today. They found these same species in Antarctica. So go ahead and go to the next slide. So this one's kind of my favorite because it's the secrets of Antarctica's fossilized forests. Oh, is that the next one? Oh, we'll ignore that one. Go to the next one. Wait, nope, go back to B. It was it. I messed up. My bad. I can't even see that far. So it's the secrets of Antarctica's fossilized forest. And as you can see here, there's a picture of basically what looks like the rainforest in the Congo with dinosaurs there. So according to this article from scientists, that 100 million years ago, the Earth was in an extreme greenhouse effect, which was the terrarium, which is what God tells us how it was. Okay, so before that, in Antarctica, rainforests inhabited by dinosaurs existed in their place on Antarctica. Okay, so the first person to uncover evidence for this was the explorer Robert Falcon Scott. He was at the South Pole in 1912 when he stumbled over fossil plants on the Beardmore Glacier down in Antarctica. And so because of this fossil discoveries, it opened up a whole new window into Antarctica's subtropical past. Here's a recent professor whose name is Jane Francis, and she's from the University of Leeds. And she spent the last 10 years down in Antarctica studying and collecting fossils and plants while she was there. And she says, I find the idea that Antarctica was once forested completely mind-boggling. We take for granted that Antarctica has always been a frozen wilderness, but ice caps only appeared relatively recently in geological history. Very interesting. So, however, the fossils show that these subtropical forests existed on Antarctica during even earlier times, which was considered the age of the dinosaurs. I was trying to get to that. So basically, it wasn't just trees that found their way to cope with in Antarctica. Amazing fossil discoveries show that dinosaurs foraged in the tangled undergrowth of Antarctica. And they've actually found some dinosaur skeletons in Antarctica. So if the oceans existed before then and we had plate tectonics, how did these dinosaurs and all these trees get there? I totally believe that the Earth was once all one landmass.
How did the meteors, how did the craters on the moon get facing towards us, not away from us?
I'm going to get to that. So trees and pollen have been found under the ice in Antarctica. So these same species exist in South America and New Zealand. So the Earth's crust now has been blown into space. So you can go ahead and go to that next. You can go to that next slide. So this is actually Google Earth. I challenge you guys to go and just spend some time looking at Google Earth and looking where the Pacific Ocean and things are. So it's hard to tell right here. You have to get up close to it. But there's this is the backside of basically North America. And the light blue is still landmass, it's just barely under the ground. However, the dark blue, there's a definite line. It's not just a little depth, it completely breaks off and is gone. So imagine if all of that was the crust of the Earth, if the entire Earth was all land, and then all of a sudden, all of these fountains of the deep burst loose, it's going to blow all of that out. And that's why I believe the Pacific Ocean was once all land, and now this land has been blown out into space, and that is how we get meteorites, asteroids, comets, etc. Go ahead to the next one. So this one is a little bit closer, kind of zoomed in. This is basically, you're looking at Alaska with Russia kind of up to the left. Look at how deep just that fall off is right there. So like I said, the light blue is land that was probably before the flood probably was up, but you can see the definite ridge of where all this was blown out. You can keep going. There's a couple more I just wanted to show. This is the same thing you see in Africa. People want to say that because they look like they fit together, that South America and Africa were attached at one time, and then they floated apart. There's no way they're going to float apart that far. More than likely, if you judge, you can see that all of that is deep and that there's a definite break off of the coast of Africa where it just drops off and land is missing. It's deep. The ocean is deep there. These are the fountains of the deep that were there before. You can keep going. Same thing. This is off the coast of Australia. You can kind of see how also down in the Pacific, how it breaks up as well. Keep going. This one I picked because there was an article just recently that was on the internet talking about, see how this is England and Europe, and you see the darker blue where it drops off, but you see the lighter blue where that's actually land that just recently as water's come up. Go to the next slide. There's actually an article where this actually existed during the Ice Age because the water levels weren't as high, and so it was an area in Europe that was called Dodgerland. But ever since the Ice Age has kind of come back and the water's melted, this is now underwater. But you can see how the actual land mass was all one piece at one time and not just islands. Go ahead and go to the next one. So that brings me to my next point. So you may say, Brooks, that sounds completely insane. You know, somebody probably kicked you in the head when you were younger. You know, this doesn't make any scientific sense. But what is constantly being brought up now is this ultimate doomsday in the United States that basically is the same thing that they're talking about that is here. What is the constant doomsday that they're talking about? Anybody know?
Trump?
That too. That's his hair right there. That's where his hair's been. No, it's the Yellowstone volcano. And essentially, they keep warning that as this Yellowstone volcano explodes and erupts and explodes like they think it will, that basically half of the country, the land of half of the country is going to be blown out. And then the ash and everything that comes afterwards is going to blanket the rest of the country. And you may be saying, well, how is that even possible? Go to the next slide. So these are the geologic pressures that are essentially underneath Yellowstone now. So there is the geyser and there's some volcanic activity there. However, if that main focus right there, that's just the tip. If that thing had enough thermal volcanic activity to blow out, you could see how easily not just the mantle and the crust could be blown out, but not just the crust could be blown out, but the mantle as well. So this isn't beyond the realm of scientific possibility that volcanic activity could easily blow the crust of the earth into space.
Kudos for your title, too.
Exactly. So, again, we're talking about now all of this material has been ejected into space. And so, because of that, there's a thing that's called, is a theory that exists in science these days called the late heavy bombardment time period. And I'm going to mention it in millions of years because I'm going to go through a few other articles real quick. But I just want you to understand that the articles are going to use these things, but as you see, they keep kind of using the same dates. So apparently, in the past, there was this cataclysmic event that took place in the solar system that basically blew out, and all of a sudden there's all this debris, and it's impacting all of the inner planets between Mercury, Mars, and then their satellites as well. So Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, and their satellites are all impacted by what they call the late heavy bombardment era. It's also known as the lunar cataclysm. So it is an event that has supposedly occurred 4.1 to 3.8 billion years ago, okay, wherein a disproportionately large number of asteroids and comets collided with the terrestrial planets and their natural satellites of the inner solar system. So evidence derives from moon rock samples of lunar craters brought back by the Apollo astronauts and isotopic dating showing that the rocks were last molten during impact events in a rather narrow interval of time, suggesting that a large portion of the craters were formed during this period. So,
Is the decay rate the same in space as it is on Earth?
well, that's a good question. But, so, what it's saying is, at one time, there were no space rocks. And then all of a sudden, there's this huge event that happens that they don't know why it happened that basically scarred up all of the planets. It was when God destroyed the earth, he didn't just destroy that, but all of creation too bears the signs of our sinful nature. That's why it talks about all of creation is also groaning to be released from this and back to perfection. So here's a funny one I thought. I kind of got a good kick out of this little article here where it says, first evidence of early meteorite bombardment of Earth. So in this article, they say it's widely accepted that the moon was heavily bombarded at this time, creating huge craters and basins. But yet we can't find this on the Earth because there's little evidence of this catastrophic event. Well, that's because the Earth is the one that sent the catastrophic event out. And so researchers have found these very old, essentially sedimentary rocks that were derived from the Earth's early crust. Sound familiar? And they contain they can have, I cannot speak all of a sudden, they contain some kind of, anomaly, that's the word I'm looking for, thank you, in the isotope composition of the element tungsten, okay? Here's the key part, such anomalies are usually found in meteorites. To our knowledge, this is the first time these anomalies, I cannot speak, that too, have been shown to exist in terrestrial samples. Here's the funny part. There is no plausible mechanism by which the tungsten isotope could have been preserved in the Earth's dynamic crust mantle environment. Therefore, we conclude these rocks must be a compound derived from meteorites. Or more than likely, it was always there, and the meteorites are part of the Earth's crust returning to Earth and hitting. Okay? So, essentially, there's more evidence that this is what happened at the flood. And then the last thing is, because NASA loves to tout this as, we found life in space. And what it is they found bacteria on Mars. Do you guys remember the great debate between Ken Ham and Bill Nye, the mechanical engineering guy? So what was the crazy thing when they were talking about how life got on the planet? What was the crazy thing that Bill Nye came up with? Y'all remember?
He came up with a lot of really crazy things. That argument was really bad.
So he basically said that, I don't know how many millions of years ago, but there was an asteroid that hit Mars. And it hit Mars with enough force that it blew out a huge chunk. That huge chunk where there was life on Mars then floated through space, entered the Earth's atmosphere, and then landed on the Earth, and that was where life came from Mars to Earth. That's what he said. And they found evidence of bacteria on Mars. And so here's one of the things. Here was a little article. This one, I remember this one came out because it made me laugh. Go to the next slide. No. Oh, yeah, let's go. Let's look at that one. I jumped ahead. So go to the next one real quick. Go back to that dark side of the moon. Yeah, dark side of the moon, yeah. So again, this is the dark side of the moon. Notice it's cratered heavily, but it's still got its original crust. It's still got its original, silvery crust and dust that basically the Bible describes how it could reflect the thing. So this is the backside of the moon that we never see, because the way the moon orbits the Earth in this weird kind of orbit, we only see the front of the moon. So when you go and look at the front of the moon, next slide, you can see how heavily damaged it is. So the front looks completely different than the backside, which we never see, which they say gets the most meteorite impacts. So think about it. Think about the landmass that we looked at on the backside of the Pacific Ocean, and when that was blown out with such force and the moon was behind it, and then it took that impact, it took the main brunt, which is what created the basins and the craters that we see on the front side of the moon. That's why it's in such worse shape than the backside, than the dark side of the moon. Does that make sense? Like I said, this is all me. This is just what I've studied. So, all right, so now let's talk about Mars and bacteria. So good. So this was an article from NASA back in, I think, 2002 or 1, where they basically found a meteorite, and it was supposedly came from Mars, and it had evidence that one time bacteria was in it. So basically it says that magnite crystals embedded in the meteorite were arranged in long chains, which could have only been formed by once living organisms. So researchers say that the magnite chains were probably flushed into microscopic cracks inside the Martian rock after it was shattered by an asteroid impact approximately 3.9 billion years ago. Remember, supposedly the lunar heavy bombardment, same time period. Okay? So this event probably killed the bacteria. At the same time later, so later on, another impact ejected this meteorite back into space where it landed on Earth. So what's the real probability that really happened?
We ejected it, it landed on Mars. It just sounds like they're overcomplicated.
Right. Actually, it was bacteria that came from the Earth when it ejected the material out. Now, it may have landed on Mars and then been ejected back to Earth, or it's probably a meteorite that actually came from the Earth to begin with and had bacteria on it. So the fact that this small meteorite contains such large numbers of bacteria suggests that the bacteria were widespread on the surface of Mars. Wrong. So a stone of similar size of Earth would contain many bacteria. So basically they've said that more than likely this meteorite probably came from here. So this next article, real quick. Oh man, it's already 7 o'clock. This next article, real quick, is only a few months old. And it says that the lunar rover has basically found what it was looking for. So that there is geological evidence that could suggest that life existed on the red planet billions of years ago, and that what they did was they came and they found a rock that had strange spots. And so it had an ancient chemical reaction that says that the rock once supported microorganisms or bacteria. So on Earth, these types of features are often associated with the fossilized record of microbes living in the subsurface. So what's more likely, that actually there were microbes and bacteria on Mars, or that this rock that they found actually originated from the Earth where it had bacteria and was ejected out and landed on Mars, and that's why they found it that way? So here's the funny part. The NASA scientists still haven't confirmed how the rock was created. So here's the thing that I thought was interesting, because remember, we talked about how, the water was underneath the ground, and it flowed up through the ground, and then rivers came and all this, and basically watered the earth, and then it misted. So here's what I thought was interesting. This rock that they're talking about, it says that white veins of calcium sulfide are present clear evidence that water, crucial for life, once ran through the rock. So more than likely, that rock had water running through it on the Earth and was blown out. And it's now on Mars, and now they think, oh, there's life on Mars because of this. Do what?
Calcium sulfide in saltwater.
Right. So I just thought this was interesting, and I think it's just more proof that it just proves more than that there's aliens, that the Bible's true and that this happened. So the last one I thought was interesting was, you guys are way too young and you don't remember this, but I do. So back in the Apollo days, on Apollo 12, one of the things that they did on that mission was they had sent, years ahead of time, they had sent an unmanned lander to the moon to kind of study landing sites for the Apollo program. So they landed, and they landed it was like a pinpoint landing, and they landed literally like 30 yards from this thing. So they got some samples off of it and did some other things, and then they brought them back to Earth. And when they brought them back to Earth, they found that there were bacteria on these things. And they were like, there's bacteria on the moon because it's on these parts. But what they found out later was it was bacteria that actually had left on the satellite itself. They didn't clean it well enough, and it left with it and had been living on the moon for the last 2 years on the lander itself, and they just brought it back to Earth. So I found this last thing, and then we'll wrap up because it's already after 7, and I apologize that I haven't gone any further than where I'm at now. So could microbes survive a trip to Mars? So NASA's going to talk about it. So basically, yes, they can. And here's why. So yes, it is possible for microorganisms to survive the journey from Earth to Mars. And that is why we are specifically dedicated to ensuring spacecraft are as clean as possible before leaving Earth. If we ever did, this is the funniest part, if we ever detect life on Mars, we are certain that it did not come from our planet. I'm sorry, you're wrong. Sorry, science. Science. So there is one prominent type of microbe that could survive the journey that are called bacteria endospores, which can form seed-like structures that allow them to stay dormant until better conditions arise. This superpower is why spore-forming bacteria are given special focus when NASA cleans spacecraft being sent to Mars. So is it possible that bacteria can actually leave Earth and make it all the way to Mars or the moon and still be intact? The answer is yes. So anyway, so more than likely there's not bacteria on Mars. If there is, it came from this planet. So anyway, that's where I just kind of want to stop talking right now. Like I said, I know it's like almost 7:10, so I apologize. But this is what I'm talking about. When God said he was going to destroy the earth and everything on it, this is what he meant. He literally ripped the planet apart. All the biomass, everything. When Noah stepped off the ark, it didn't look like anything that he had seen beforehand. It was completely different. So that's all I got for this evening because we're out of time. Questions, comments? Anybody?